For his entire time in office, Doug Ford has consistently made life harder for almost all Ontarians. He is consistently one of the least popular premiers in Canada, and yet he still has managed to win 2 majority governments and is still polling well going into his third campaign. Why is that? Who really is Doug Ford, and what can we stand to learn from looking at his family history?
Okay.
All right, let's do this. Most of the facts and information from this video come from the Globe and Mail article, and I highly suggest that you go and read it. If you like this kind of long-form content, please like and subscribe, leave some comments. I've also started a podcast called Perfectly Frank. My first guest was Chris Paul Rainbows. You can check that out on my YouTube channel or on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. If you're familiar with me, you know that I'm not a fan of Doug, nor do I intend to humanize him in any way. But I think we owe it to ourselves to understand this man and why he is the way he is. We're going to talk about the Ford family's history with drug dealing, the alleged drama and scandals within his family, and political associations Doug has made for himself. And along the way, we'll try to figure out why Doug is the way he is. My money's on daddy issues. Doug Ford isn't the first MPP in his family. He's not even the first MPP named Doug. His father, Doug Ford Sr., was a one-term MPP under Mike Harris representing Etobicoke. One thing me and Doug Jr. have in common, though, is that our grandparents are immigrants, with his coming from England. The main difference between his grandfather and mine is that his grandfather was sent to Canada for being unruly. He also later lied about being born in Canada. I guess the grand apple doesn't fall too far from the grand tree. Because when we talk about who Doug Ford is, it's hard not to mention his family's alleged history in drug dealing. Doug Ford was known for being a hash dealer in the 1980s. Beyond the articles that have been written about this, I actually know people who were from the Etobicoke and Rexdale areas who knew him when he was younger. And while anything that those people say is hearsay and not really reliable, nothing that I've been told stands out as something that we don't already know about Doug. He was personable. He liked to be liked. He was a bit rough around the edges, but he had the backs of those that he considered his friends and allies. Some people were fond of how Doug managed to stay out of trouble, unlike other members of his group, the RY Drifters. He was described as being business-minded and savvy, but Doug wasn't just a low-level dealer. According to the Globe and Mail investigation, he was a hash supplier to other dealers, and when he did sell, he would sell not in grams, but in pounds. And for those who seem to deny these claims and assume that it's fake, if this was unfounded and fake, why hasn't Doug sued the Globe and Mail to take this article down? It's been up for over a decade. If it was false, Doug would very easily be able to have this retracted. Doug allegedly dealt from around the ages of 15 to 22. While that was over 40 years ago, and we shouldn't inherently allow the sins of somebody's youth to be held against them forever, Doug Ford's role as a politician and his rhetoric about criminals stands in stark contrast to the forgiveness that many voters seem to lend to Ford while not lending them to other individuals. And let's remember, Ford grew up wealthy. He never needed the money. This wasn't a crime of necessity to put food on the table. Doug did this because he wanted to. And I think it all stems from Doug's lifelong desire to be admired, to be respected, and to be loved. Doug Sr. founded Deco Labels and Tags, and from there was able to launch a successful business that now does over $100 million a year in sales. Funnily enough, one of their major clients is Loblaws. Funny how the Premier's company has such a lucrative contract. Good thing we all trust Doug Ford and Galen Weston so much. Doug and Rob have also been caught abusing their powers as city councilors to benefit companies that were clients of Deco. Deco was eventually sold to Aries Management in October of 2022. This is notable as the CFO of Thermi Spa, who was responsible for destroying Ontario Place, formerly worked for Aries Management, albeit in 2020. In between the CFO being hired and Deco Labels being purchased, the Investment Management Corporation of Ontario made a deal with Aries for $500 million. Thermi Spa was also announced for the Ontario Place redevelopment shortly after Deco was purchased, with Doug promising at the time over $650 million for redevelopment and additional parking spots for the spa. Also, to be specific, the part of Deco Labels that was purchased was the Chicago wing of the business, the only part of the business to be 100% wholly owned by Doug Ford. As far as I can tell, Doug's only real-world work experience was working for his father's company, and later helping with their American expansion. It would probably be hard for a former hash dealer who dropped out of college after a few weeks to get a job without family connections. But this US connection is part of why Doug Ford has such a love for Republicans and has stated that he has unwavering support for Donald Trump and that he was happy when Trump won the recent election.
Are you still a supporter of Donald Trump?
Absolutely. I wouldn't waver.
Too bad that leopard ate your face, Doug. Crazy when that happens, you know? According to some employees, Doug didn't do a bad job of running the company, and it was his brother Randy who was the poor businessman. That doesn't surprise me. For all of his faults, Doug has always been a people person. We all remember his early career as a distributor of smokable goods. Unfortunately, while Doug might have been a people person and a good businessman, that doesn't speak to his individual character, as he was accused by his brother Rob Ford's widow of mismanaging Rob's estate and trying to force her to sell all of her shares of Deco. In her lawsuit, she alleges that Doug negligently and inappropriately mismanaged them as to destroy their value, and improperly arranged for infusions of funds from Doug Sr.'s estate. In Doug's defense, though, she was later found to be negligent in paying her lawyers. This also came after she was arrested for impaired driving in 2016 and before she ended up running for the PPC. Rob's wife isn't the only family member who has had run-ins with the law. The ironic part of this is that when the Ford family talks about being tough on crime, they seem to gloss over their own family's history with criminality. Fentanyl kingpins are bad, drug dealers are an issue, but Doug hasn't seemed to reckon with his own history there. And it's not just Doug. His brother Randy and his sister Kathy have a history in the drug trade too. Randy had at one time been arrested for forcible confinement. When he wasn't fond of another dealer's behavior, Randy and two associates kidnapped him, beat him up, and held him for ransom, demanding his parents pay up. The man in question reportedly owed Randy and company $5,000. There is no court record of how this matter was resolved. But Randy isn't the only Ford sibling with a history. Doug's sister Kathy has had many incidents of note. Before I get into those, though, I do want to take a second to talk about Kathy's son, Michael Ford. By all accounts, from everyone I have spoken to and everything I've read online, Michael Ford is a good man. Even Merritt Stiles had spoken positively of him before he had become an MPP. Michael Ford is by far the member of the Ford family who seems to be the most genuine and the most good-hearted. He has done his best to stay out of trouble and do good work. And while there is no evidence for this, it also feels as though his political career may have been thrusted upon him as opposed to something he sought out. Starting as a school trustee before filling in Rob Ford's city council seat and then later becoming an MPP, Michael actually stepped down in September of 2024. Earlier this year, he also decided that he would not seek re-election. He states that it's for his health, and I believe him. So when I talk about Michael's mother and father, I want to make it extremely clear that as we continue to understand the Ford family, that Michael should not be painted with the same brush. You may have noticed that it is Michael's mom who is a Ford, yet Michael still retains the family name. This is because he legally changed his name to remove all connections to his father, Ennio Stirpe. Ennio was convicted both of manslaughter and attempted murder. The man who was killed by Ennio was Kathy's lover, and Kathy and Ennio were divorced when this happened. The man in question was also a white supremacist, a group which Kathy Ford is familiar with, as she was friends with many notable white supremacists, including the man who created the Canadian chapter of the KKK in the 1980s. It should be noted that while Kathy may have been associated with the white supremacy movement, none of the brothers were ever seen at meetings or events. And it's also said that Doug Ford Sr. did not view it positively. But those aren't the only one of Kathy's partners who have had run-ins with the law. In 2012, her longtime boyfriend, who is a convicted cocaine dealer, was arrested for threatening to murder Rob Ford at his home. And while Doug insists he does not know this boyfriend, in 2005 he was accused of shooting Kathy Ford in the face during an altercation in her parents' basement. Then there's the case of Doug's kids. Normally, I would say that children of politicians are off limits, which is also why I was so careful when talking about Michael Ford, but one of Doug's daughters, Krista, has made herself the center of attention over the last few years. We're also the same age, so she's an adult. Krista was a member of the Lingerie Football League, which is exactly what it sounds like. She later became prominent as a major supporter of the Freedom Convoy and has been a vocal MAGA supporter. She also criticized the slut walk movement by telling women to defend themselves with weapons and to not dress like a whore. I do not in any way want to police what women should and shouldn't do with their bodies, but Doug's drug-dealing hypocrisy with his anti-crime narrative is really showing itself in Krista with her Lingerie Football League tenure, followed by those specific comments. And once again, I want to clarify, women should wear whatever they want. I'm not criticizing her choices of work or clothing, just her derogatory comments and the hypocrisy. But back to the Freedom Convoy and COVID, Krista was such a big proponent of the movement that her and her husband showed their principled stance by vocally refusing to be vaccinated. Her husband, who is a Toronto police officer, was then put on unpaid leave for his vaccination status. They are currently in a legal battle over this with the Toronto police, and they started a GoFundMe seeking to raise $100,000 to help with the legal costs. This was in January of 2025. There's a lot more I could go into about each of the Fords. I didn't even touch on one of his other daughters, whose cookie company had to change its name for having the initials KKK. I barely even talked about Doug's actual time on Toronto City Council or as Premier, both of which have limitless scandals I can make videos about. And I went this entire video without mentioning Doug's brother Rob, the former mayor of Toronto, who was caught smoking crack multiple times.
Yes, I have smoked crack cocaine.
This is all to say that the Ford family has, since their landing in Canada over 100 years ago, has consistently found themselves in trouble, surrounded by trouble, married to trouble, or otherwise have been mired in family drama, the likes of which would cause most people to hesitate to associate any further. And by all accounts, Doug is the most successful and stable Ford, and he was literally a drug dealer. Earlier in the video, I mentioned daddy issues. What comes next is based entirely on my speculation, but I am simply trying to psychologically understand Doug. It seems as though for a while, due to his involvement and success in politics, Rob was seen as the favorite child. I think that Doug loved his brother Rob immensely, but he always craved and desired the approval from his father that Rob got. Doug loved the sticker and label business. He was good at it. Leaving it for politics didn't make much sense. But Rob had always found himself in trouble with substances and in general struggled to maintain composure at times. Doug was there for him. And that's why Doug is constantly putting himself in rooms with powerful people. Whether it's giving away MZOs to developers who attended his daughter's wedding, or the cash for access stag and doe held for his daughter, which, side note, by the way, I know we have no way to prove whether or not any conversations did happen, but it's kind of hard to think that nothing happened when so many of those people got MZOs after the fact. And like, we've all been to weddings before. We know that people give gifts. We don't know what kind of gifts were given. I'm not assuming that anybody gave a gift that was inappropriate, but like, it's something that could have happened, you know? And let's not forget about the backroom conversations with developers about opening the Greenbelt, or the connections to his label company and Thermi Spa, or any of the other scandals involving the rich and powerful. Doug Ford is constantly seeking the approval of the ruling class. He just wants to be patted on the back and told that he's doing a good job. He wants to be thanked. And as a sly politician, he has been able to simultaneously pull this off with the rich, as well as the everyday voter who doesn't get bogged down in the details. Unfortunately, the everyday average voter isn't benefiting from Ford's actions as he continues to decimate our province. Doug notoriously doesn't drink, although he might love making beer more accessible. He might love it so much that he spent hundreds of millions of dollars, if not over $1 billion, on getting beer in corner stores before the current election. I think part of that was seeing members of his family struggle with alcohol and other substances. I honestly believe that Doug thinks that we need to be tough on dealers because they perpetuate issues that have affected his own family. It's just wild that he doesn't realize or accept the fact that he had a hand to play in this too. But that's who Doug Ford is. It was hard making this video. I didn't want to attack the Fords. I was just trying to get down to how a family could be the way that they are. Over my time as a teacher and as I've gotten older, I realized how fortunate and lucky that I am that I grew up in a family without any scandal at all. There's not really any divorce in my family. All of my cousins are successful. Everybody gets along with each other for the most part, although most of my cousins do hate the videos that I make. Well, that's not true. Some of them like it, some of them don't. And I have cousins who have been extremely successful without anybody there to give them a hand up. And it just blows my mind that Doug has been given this cakewalk through life, both a business handed to him and a political dynasty. I guess what I'm trying to say is that Doug has been surrounded by so much hardship, and a lot of that caused by poor decision making, yet Doug seems to not be able to extend any empathy to people who are struggling. And I don't understand how you can go through 60 years of life and not start to feel empathy for people who are not born into similar situations, to not feel for people who weren't given a leg up, to not feel for people who had to struggle in every capacity. I come from privilege, not as much as Doug, but I did live a fairly privileged life. And that's why I fight so damn hard every day to make a better province for each and every person who lives here, because I want other people to have what I had. Doug doesn't want that for you. He doesn't care. But before my editor was even done with this video, we actually have an update, because leaked audio of Doug Ford from a police gala just got released, where Doug Ford said that he's in favor of bringing back the death penalty. He was in a room full of cops and he made them feel uncomfortable by stating he wanted to bring back the death penalty. And he said this in relation to people who do violent crimes during home invasion, which is kind of ironic when you go back to consider what Randy Ford was arrested for. Seriously, this family has zero empathy for other people, unless you're one of his billionaire buddies. I don't know what to say other than Doug Ford is a piece of If you like that video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment, check out my podcast, follow me on the podcast and the TikTok and the Instagram. I don't know, there's usually stuff down there. Thank you once again to my editor. I'm probably going to be launching a Patreon soon because I need to pay him. And so I'll tell you about that next time. Thanks. And also, I just launched my Patreon. It's in the description down below. Go check it out, because the person who edited this video needs to get paid.
Okay.